Rolling Stone, up in the early days, up until when I started to work there, they just took whatever material they had and they made it the cover. They cut it out, and there was no kind of formality to the cover. And I started to think, well, why, we had this opportunity where you could actually pose the cover. Rod Stewart would show up and say, okay, what are we going to do? I mean, I had no idea what we were going to do. Grace Slick, which was the first cover I did, was really just going with Ben Fong-Torres to their house near Golden Gate Park, and Ben Fong-Torres interviewed them while I took pictures. That I loved, because I was back in my element of just photographing someone as they were doing something, and I didn't have to be responsible for I could just observe and take photographs. There's a really nice set of pictures of Grace Slick and Paul Kantner on a waterbed, just talking and smoking, and it's an interesting study, from that time. One doesn't have it totally figured out, and you have to leave room for something else that might happen. I think that an early conceptual photograph that's like that is the Whoopi Goldberg in the bathtub. She was a young, upcoming comedian. I didn't know who she was. Her routine was that she played a little black girl trying to scrub her skin off and thinking that underneath she would be white. And I met her in Berkeley. She was living in Berkeley. We went to a friend's apartment, and I had this idea that she would just be scrubbing her skin off in the bathtub, working like scrubbing, based on her comedy routine. And we filled the bathtub with milk. I didn't want it to be cold milk, so we heated it up. It was warm milk. So when she got in the tub, she sort of slid into the milk, and there was a very graphic image. This very black person in this very white tub, and hence that picture. But it wasn't what I originally imagined. I always find that so strange that people would think that you wouldn't do your research on a subject, especially today. You can Google anybody, and it's quite interesting. I look at the photographs that have been done on the person, and I learn a lot from what they have done, what they're willing to do, what hasn't been done, what would be interesting to try. It's so important. I mean, it totally feeds what the photograph would be. I'm not ever asking someone to jump in a pool just for the sake of jumping in a pool. I see a lot of work that tries to emulate what I do, and it's disconnected. You're not really dealing with. It's important to stay on subject, and all the work that I've ever done, it has the ideas emulate from that person. I was having the opportunity to photograph Louise Bourgeois at her home. We had an appointed time, and I arrived with my two assistants, and I was planning on setting up some lights, and I could see that she was ready. And I sent my assistants to the back of the house to set up the lights. And I told them where she would sit and blah, blah. And then I went with her to the front room of her house, which had some nice light in it. I could see she was ready, So I just started taking photographs of her by myself, in the front room. There are photographs of her when she was younger with her hair down, and she had her hair up. And this happens so many times when you photograph someone older. They don't think they're older. They really don't. They have a kind of, sometimes you can see their younger selves in them, It must be particularly difficult, when you're going to have your photograph done. I think I was just transfixed or something, but I thought she was so beautiful with her hair down in those early photographs of her. I asked her to put her hair down, and she did. She just put her hair down. And And she put her hand up like that. And I just took a few photographs just with the daylight coming in through the window. And she was definitely participating. And then one of my assistants came from the back and said, "Okay, we're ready. The lights are ready." And I said, "I'm done." The biggest breakthrough in the conceptual work for the covers was not Rolling Stone magazine. It was an assignment I had from Life magazine. And can you imagine being where I was and starting to get this work from Life? It was pretty amazing to be asked to do work for Life. No pun intended. How poetic, though, that they asked me to do a series on poets. It was an incredible assignment because, first of all, it was a series, and they were series of portraits, and I read the poetry of each subject that I was photographing. And there's two photographs from that series that sort of survive it, that are, to me, like the foundation for my work going forward. Tess Gallagher and Robert Penn Warren. And Robert Penn Warren was writing about dying and death. He didn't live too much longer after this photograph was taken. And I realized for the first time since these were sort of formal portrait sessions, that what I began to think about was trying to emulate the poetry in the portrait by using the subject to be as if they were in one of their poems. To try to do two things at once. Not only do you have the photograph of the subject, but you also you saw the story of their poems. And that was a big breakthrough, because Robert Penn Warren I went the first time to his house. He couldn't have been nicer. And I did all these photographs, like sitting under a tree, at his desk, all of these kind of typical writer's portraits. And as I was leaving, pulling out of his driveway, I saw him upstairs in this room. He had opened the window shade and was looking at me as I drove out. It was just haunting to me, that look, this kind of, I don't know what it was, I don't know what it was. But I remember going into the studio thinking, I got to go back. I really have to go back. There's something more here. I have to go back. And I called them up and said, I want to go back and photograph you and your wife together. And under those pretenses, I got another time with him. And I went back and I walked upstairs to that room that he had been looking, out the window from. And it was his bedroom. And it was the whole house was kind of totally antiqued up and very done. And then I walked into his bedroom and it was all gray. It was like the bed was gray, the bedspread was gray. And I just sat him down on the bed. I asked him to take his shirt off, but it was more like I wanted to see his skeleton or something. I wanted to see, it wasn't like a shirtless man. It was more like he was so at ease and so at peace and so ready to die, really. And so at ease with himself. He didn't have any kind of guard or shield or anything. He was totally comfortable in a way that I think we hope we're going to be, when we're ready to die, or ready for that next phase in our lives. And that was that photograph. which, was a very compelling image for me. It doesn't mean the same to other people when they look at it, but to me, it was just a big breakthrough. Tess Gallagher was just more whimsy, it was more, she was kind of, a, a little silly and goofy, and she had all these clothes in her closet, and she wanted to dress up. And Tess Gallagher wrote about horses. She showed me a home movie she had shot on horseback. There were masks all over her house and coat racks full of clothes. She wanted to get dressed up, and she pulled the sequin dress out of her closet. So when you were with Gallagher, you were in her world, and you could see the way her imagination worked. The Tess Gallagher portrait is the beginning of placing my subject in the middle of an idea. On some level, when you had an idea, it was almost and if it was a good idea, it could be a relief for the subject. Meryl Streep, who did not want to really be dealing with herself. She was sick of herself. And I think that to be able to get out of herself and play a role and, have a white face, and it just feeds back to doing your homework. You have to be prepared, have an idea of who you're photographing and what they do. And because she comes from a tradition of theater and mimes, to be able to portray, what she thinks her role might be, I think was a relief for her, and she enjoyed it, because of that. You can see the real self in it, in those roles. I think the real self comes out even more in those roles. Pirelli Tire Company for over 50 years has been producing a sort of a limited edition calendar for its clients. I guess they print just about 10,000 of these. For decades, it's been mostly a cheesecake kind of thing, always filled with, women with not very much on. However, at the same time, it was a prestigious commission for a photographer. For the year 2000, I was asked to do the calendar. In 2016, they came to me again. It was their idea to do women of distinction. Thinking about women I wanted to photograph, I pulled in a lot of people that I cared about, like Yoko Ono and Patti Smith and Agnes Gunn. I looked at the Amy Schumer show and found a lot of extraordinary episodes in them, and a lot of issues that she was dealing with on the Amy Schumer show that I was really impressed with, who she was. So I asked her if she would come in, and she said she would. She was, and I had never met her. And she comes in, and I explained to her the concept that this is the Pirelli calendar. Everyone's wearing their clothes, and you have to, and you should look like you didn't get the memo, and you're the only one without your clothes on. She said, fine, great, let's do it. Come on, let's do it. And then I said to her, I know you're self-conscious about your body. She said, I am not self-conscious about my body. I love my body. It's fine. I'm great. And I was like totally impressed with her, and thus she was so cool. We used that picture for the calendar. It was definitely an Amy Schumer moment, period. And the Vanity Fair cover story came next. I was trying to think of things for her to do and seeing who she is, and she's not embarrassed about anything. The idea was her crotch is basically replaced with a fire. What was very awkward about the actual shoot, she insisted upon wearing no underwear for the picture. And I think her publicist was there and was aghast. But that's Amy Schumer. I've always wanted to photograph Keith, and I think I actually was asked by a magazine from Florida to take his picture of all places. It was not done for Vanity Fair or Vogue or anyone. So I had seen the photographs that Robert Mapplethorpe had done of Grace Jones. Keith had painted Grace Jones, and I thought, oh, he painted Grace Jones, maybe he could paint himself. I needed to give him a background, so I thought, well, okay, well, I'll create some kind of room for him or something. And I actually built a set where I had several walls, and we got some furniture from the Salvation Army, and we painted everything white. And I said, I'd like to see, could you think you could paint the set and then paint your upper body, and you can wear white pants, and I could put you in the set. And so he painted the set in about 45 minutes. Like, he just went so fast. He's so prolific. And then he painted his upper body, and I looked at him and I said, well, why don't you do the whole thing? And he agreed. And he painted the whole rest of his body, but he's only painted on the front. He's not painted on the back. It's very funny. And he stood in the set, and we took these couple pictures, and it was done in like a few minutes. And it was funny because he felt like all dressed up and, and nowhere to go. He was beautiful. It was like he was dressed in his paint. Once he was totally painted, something else took over. And I said, well, let's go to Times Square. Let's go to Times Square. Let's just go. We got to shoot this fast because we're going to get arrested. We're just going to, Keith is going to jump out of the car. We're going to shoot this, and then, we're going to jump back in the car, and we have to do this really fast. And so we got up to Times Square, and Keith jumps out of the car. We jump out of the car. We shoot, it's like, and no one pays us any bit of attention. This is like New York City. Like, who cares? We took those pictures in Times Square, and those are kind of amazing. And then, that was that.